Does Social Security need saving? Providing for retirees throughout the 21st century by Dimitri Papadimitriou and Randall Wray. Can accumulating the OASDI trust funds ensure that retirees will be provided for? Whether we assume that there is no looming crisis or that the future will unfold more or less as the trustees have projected, it is still appropriate, even necessary, to think in long-range terms. Can we, or should we, do anything today to ensure that the elderly will be cared for tomorrow? The current belief behind the operation of OASDI is that a large trust fund can help ease the burden created by demographic changes and slow projected growth of taxable real wages. The purpose of a trust fund is thought to be to accumulate financial reserves now, which can be depleted in later years, when Social Security program expenditures exceed the revenues that will be generated from a shrinking taxable base. In other words, annual surpluses will be saved over the next 20 years in order to provide for the future consumption of retiring baby boomers. The question is, can the current generation as a whole save in real terms for its future retirement? If the current generation were to abstain from consumption, dig holes, and bury goods and services to be excavated and consumed 30 or 40 years hence, assuming no deterioration of the buried supplies, they could provide for their future consumption by saving in real terms. Presumably, the pharaohs had something like this in mind when they had goods and people to provide services buried with them in the pyramids. It is clear, however, that with the notable exception of owner-occupied housing, most of the consumption that occurs in, say, 2020 will have to be provided for by production in that year. The Social Security trust funds and all the other public and private pension funds are saving only in financial terms, in the hope that retirees will be able to purchase real goods and services for consumption when they retire. Is it possible for society to do anything today to increase the quantity of goods and services that can and will be produced tomorrow, relative to what otherwise would have been produced? That is, in the absence of a policy change, for the consumption not only of retirees, but also of workers and non-retirees who do not work. If not, then the financial savings represented by all public and private pension funds can affect only the distribution of the goods and services that will be produced in 2020. This is not an insignificant issue. If the quantity of goods and services is not increased, society may well want to change the amount of goods and services distributed to the elderly and to other demographic groups. The thinking behind much of the debate over Social Security seems to center on the fear that if we do not increase financial saving, funds will be inadequate to finance a sufficient share to the elderly to meet their needs. However, if this is what the debate is really about, most of the solutions proposed thus far have at best an uncertain probability of succeeding. This is because they center on accumulating financial reserves in the next few years by some combination of reduced benefits and increased tax rates, and by increasing the reserves' growth rate, for example, by investing them in the stock market to obtain higher returns than those expected from government bonds. It is supposed that the larger reserves will postpone the day of reckoning, since their interest earnings will supplement payroll tax receipts and assets can be sold when total revenues fall short of expenditures. Let us first examine the thinking behind proposals that would increase the distribution going to the elderly in, say, 2020 through accumulation of a larger trust fund. This is the path recommended by President Clinton in his 1999 State of the Union address, when he proposed that just over 60% of projected government surpluses over the next 15 years be set aside for the OASDI trust funds. The Treasury would use the surpluses to retire outstanding debt currently held by the public, but would then issue an equivalent amount of debt, that is, 62% of the total budget surplus each year, to be held in the trust funds. However, unless accumulation of the trust funds actually enhances society's ability to produce goods and services in the year 2020, the output to be distributed will be exactly the same, whether the trust funds are larger or smaller. In this case, the only economic justification for larger trust funds is the belief that the larger size will increase the distribution going to the retiring baby boomers. After 2020, the trust funds would begin to sell their assets to increase the nominal income of the beneficiaries, beyond the income that can be provided out of payroll taxes. If these sales were made to workers and other non-elderly income earners, who otherwise would have used their income to purchase consumption goods and services, trust fund asset sales could achieve the desired result of shifting the distribution of consumption toward the elderly. However, this is by no means a foregone conclusion. The Treasury debt held by OASDI is non-marketable. It cannot be sold to the public. OASDI must convert this debt into cash to cover spending. The Treasury then has to issue checks to cover this conversion. If the Treasury's total revenue from all taxes is not equal to its non-Social Security spending plus the non-marketable bonds redeemed by OASDI, equal to the OASDI's deficit, the Treasury will incur a general budget deficit. Let us ignore for a moment the possibility that the Treasury would increase taxes in an attempt to balance its budget, so that it issues new debt equal to its deficit. It is possible that Treasury bond sales might simply depress asset prices, not only of the government bonds being sold, but also of other public as well as private assets, either directly or because the Fed decided to increase interest rates in the belief that budget deficits would cause inflation. If the sales were made to individuals or institutions that do not reduce consumption commensurately, the increased income going to the elderly recipients of OASDI would simply compete with consumer demand that had not been affected by the asset sales. The primary result in this case could be inflation of prices of consumer goods and services rather than deflation of asset prices. There could be complex secondary and tertiary effects set off by the asset sales that are hard to estimate in advance. For this reason, we believe there is no way to guarantee that accumulation of the trust funds will actually have the desired result of shifting distribution toward the beneficiaries, and it is not clear that larger trust funds will result in a more desirable distribution. Is there a better and more direct way to ensure that the distribution will be shifted toward retirees? Yes, through use of the tax system. In the year 2020, if it is decided that the elderly should get a larger share of the distribution, then payroll taxes can be increased, reducing workers' disposable income, and benefit payments to the elderly can be increased. According to intermediate projections, it would be necessary to achieve a shift of just under 2.4% of GDP by 2075, relative to the share devoted in 1998, to meet all OASDI obligations, including obligations to the non-elderly. Note that if the goal is to affect distribution in the year 2020, it is far more direct to raise payroll taxes in the year 2020 than to raise them today in an attempt to accumulate financial assets to be sold in the year 2020, in the hope that this might indirectly affect distribution. Note also that even if non-marketable Treasury debt is held by the trust funds, to convert that debt to cash would require the Treasury to issue new debt, or to generate tax revenue in excess of what will be required for other government spending to make the cash payment to the fund without increasing general budget deficits. But this is exactly what would be required even if the trust funds had no financial holdings. This analysis casts doubt on the trustees' calculation of actuarial balance, which presumes that a tax today can affect the distribution going to OASDI beneficiaries 75 years into the future. We see no reason to suppose that an increase of the tax rate by 2.07 percentage points today would in any direct way shift the distribution of resources toward retirees in 2075. We believe it is inherently counterproductive to attempt to maintain long-range actuarial balance as the trustees are attempting to do. It would be far preferable to return to the Social Security Act's requirement that the trustees simply report the actuarial status for the ensuing 5 years. As Langer, 1999, correctly argues, a public program does not need to be run like a private program. Planning far into the future and accumulating a fund to deal with contingencies may be necessary for a private program, but it is not necessary for a public program which uses involuntary taxes, such that workers and employers cannot choose to leave the program as its revenue source. Running an OASDI surplus today generates several kinds of undesirable market distortion. Payroll taxes are higher than what is required to meet OASDI expenditures, which distorts labor markets. This makes American labor more expensive than necessary, putting domestic production at a competitive disadvantage, and it also encourages substitution of capital for labor, displacing workers and possibly raising unemployment. Asset prices may be higher today than they would be in the absence of an OASDI surplus. Similarly, asset sales would take place as the baby boom retires could distort. Similarly, asset sales that would take place as the baby boom retires could distort asset markets. Asset prices would be depressed by the flood of retirements as private and public pension funds sell assets to meet expenditures, and trust fund or treasury sales would only make matters worse. Further, the Social Security surplus obfuscates government accounting, leading to constant debates about whether the surpluses should be carried on or off budget, whether they should be set aside from general budget revenues, and whether the federal government is really running a balanced budget. We do not wish to enter the debate about the wisdom of balanced budgets, but it is difficult to argue that the OASDI programs ought to run surpluses to offset deficits in the rest of the budget. As we have pointed out, the tax base for OASDI falls on just over 40% of GDP, making it particularly inequitable revenue source for the purpose of offsetting general budget deficits. Milton Friedman has recently made a similar argument, pointing out that paying taxes today to build up a trust fund cannot help to provide for future retirees, and that a trust fund is little more than an accounting gimmick. Quote, "Taxes paid by today's workers are used to pay today's retirees. If money is left over, it finances other government spending, though, to maintain the insurance friction, paper entries are created in a trust fund that is simultaneously an asset and a liability of the government. When the benefits that are due exceed the proceeds from payroll taxes, as they will in the not very distant future, the difference will have to be financed by raising taxes, borrowing, creating money, or reducing other government spending. And that is true no matter how large the trust fund End quote. Friedman, 1999. Herb Stein, 1999, seemed to reach the same conclusion when he humorously recommended that Social Security be saved simply by issuing $10 trillion in Treasury securities today. Why wait for accumulation of an OASDI surplus, and why save Social Security only through 2055, as President Clinton's plan is supposed to do, or through 2075? If $10 trillion is not enough, the Treasury can immediately issue $50 trillion, or $50 quadrillion, or $50 quadrillion, or to the trust funds to save them for eternity. In summary, it would be far more straightforward to increase the tax on workers in the year 2020 and increase the benefits paid to retirees at the time than to try to accumulate financial reserves over the next 21 years in the hope that the OASDI trustees or the Treasury could sell financial assets in the year 2020 and thereby affect the distribution of real goods and services going to the elderly. This could work smoothly only if those who obtained income from working in the year 2020 decided to reduce consumption in that year in order to buy the assets being sold to provide for retirees. It is possible, perhaps likely, that the asset sales would merely depress asset prices and that competition for consumption by workers and retirees would drive up prices of goods and services. While it is conceivable that the net result would be a greater distribution going to the elderly, that result is not assured. Why not simply use the tax system in the year 2020 or 2030 or 2075 to guarantee the desired result? The burden of providing real goods and services to retirees in 2020, 2030, and 2075 will be borne by workers in those years, regardless of the tax imposed today. And if the level of goods and services to be produced cannot be increased by actions taken today, then the burden that will be borne cannot be reduced by anything we do today. This argument hinges on the assumption that accumulation of a trust fund does not directly affect the quantity of goods and services that will be produced in a future year. Most conventional economic theory holds that the long-run growth path of the economy is not easily changed. Most economic analysis presumes that long-run growth cannot be affected by government policy. Thus, at the very least, the argument for accumulation of a trust fund as a means of increasing society's ability to provide for the needs of OASDI 35 years into the future rests on shaky theoretical grounds. If this argument is rejected, then the proposed reforms boil down to schemes that would merely attempt to shift the distribution to retirees. But if this shift is all that reformers intend, it can be accomplished much more simply and effectively through use of the tax system at the time the shift is desired. If economists believe there is something like a natural long-run growth rate, they must advocate a pay-as-you-go system for the long run, and must conclude that payroll taxes should be reduced now so that program revenues and costs would be more closely aligned. Payroll taxes would then have to be increased in the future to maintain the desired distribution of resources to beneficiaries. On the grounds that accumulation of a trust fund is not likely to have a great impact on long-run growth, it cannot assure the desired future distribution of resources, and it distorts current and future market prices. We conclude that it makes little sense to accumulate a huge trust fund.